everyone, and welcome to the Traceability Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Tracy Edwards, and today we're so very fortunate to have Dr. Rebecca Hinds with us. Dr. Rebecca is a leading expert on organizational behavior and the future of work. She holds a BS, MS, and PhD from Stanford University and has spent the last decade advising companies on how to collaborate more effectively in a rapidly changing workplace. Rebecca founded the Work Innovation Lab at Asana and the Work AI Institute at Glean, two pioneering corporate think tanks conducting cutting edge research on how teams work, communicate, and make decisions. Her upcoming book, Your Best Meeting Ever, is a science backed blueprint for fixing broken meeting culture. Through 7 product design principles, she teaches leaders how to transform meetings from time wasters into powerful drivers of alignment, clarity, and real results. Her work has been featured in Harvard Business Review, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Wired, Bloomberg, Fast Company, and more. With that introduction, Dr. Rebecca Hinds, welcome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. I'm really looking forward to the conversation, and it's great to be here.
As I mentioned when we first signed on, the meeting culture is such a terrific topic for us to be focused on. I think we are all a little done in sometimes by meetings and the volume of meetings that we have. So, as we jump in, you have definitely helped some of the world's most respected organizations rethink how they work. And so, what originally pulled you into studying organizational behavior and meeting culture specifically?
So, I've always been fascinated by how organizations work. And I think part of that, I grew up as a competitive swimmer and was always fascinated by teamwork and how do you bring together a group of people in a way that the sum is greater than the sum of the individual parts is the whole is greater than the sum of the individual parts and wanting to apply that to organizations. How can we design and structure our organizations such that we're getting the best out of our people, in particular in that team format? And so from, very early in my career, even out of high school, I was fascinated by organizational behavior. And when we think about meetings, meetings are the work practice that we spend the most time in, and yet they're arguably the most dysfunctional practice in our entire organizations. And so, from an organizational behavior and research perspective, it's both frustrating that this is the case in the state of work, but it's also fascinating. Why do we continue to cling to this practice that has largely remained unchanged for decades and decades, and yet is highly dysfunctional in our organizations at the same time?
Well, you bring up a terrific example with the sports metaphor. You know, you practice and you practice and you want to get the most out of your team members, but you don't want to do them in to the point where they're sort of too tired to perform, right?
Exactly. And, you can have 20 practices a week, but is that really the best intentional use of time? And similarly, meetings are the most expensive form of collaboration that we have available to us in organizations in terms of time, money, sanity. And so we should be using them as a last resort and not a first resort in terms of our default knee jerk reaction.
hmm Now, you have talked about the concept of meeting junk drawers. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on that and maybe provide an example from your research?
Sure. So the idea behind meeting junk drawers, and I think we can all relate to this, the fact that we cram so much into the meeting format in the sense of when we have a problem, we schedule a meeting. When there's uncertainty, we schedule a meeting, need alignment, schedule a meeting. And so meetings have become this junk drawer for all of our problems and uncertainty within the organization as well. And so, again, coming back to this idea of intentionality, because meetings are so expensive, we need to be strategic about what we use in meetings and how we deploy this very expensive form of collaboration.
Mhm. Your book states that it actually costs over $1 trillion a year in wasted time. So maybe what might be some of the most common root causes of that? Is it just old ways of thinking, or is it maybe a combination of old ways of thinking and maybe lacking the intentionality, as you say?
That's exactly right. There's also a dimension of human behavior that is at the core of this as well, in the sense of when we think about collaboration, and in particular, when we think about knowledge workers and desk workers, 85 to 90% of our time on average is spent collaborating with other people at work. And so much of that collaboration is invisible, meaning it happens through so many different people, places, processes, technologies. It's very difficult for any given person to understand how they've collaborated with another person, how often they've collaborated with their teams, whether that collaboration has been effective. Meetings, on the other hand, are quite visible, meaning
Mhm.
it typically calendars are public within organizations. In many cases, they are. You can see someone in a conference room, in a meeting. Often you can see a Zoom window on someone's screen. And because of that, we know human bias is to associate visibility with importance and presence with productivity. And because meetings are this very visible manifestation of work within organizations, we tend to schedule them much more frequently than they need to be scheduled. And regardless of whether anything happens in the meeting that's productive, the sheer act of meetings has a connotation of progress and productivity that is dangerous and leads us to accumulate more and more meetings over time and drive this immense cost.
Mhm. I think about the meetings that I attend or that I facilitate, and I've been on the unproductive end of both of those situations. It seems like there's not always an input and a corresponding output that sometimes happens with meetings. It's as you say, they're visible, but it doesn't always lack the things that you need to actually accomplish work.
Mhm. Exactly, and the premise of the book, Your Best Meeting Ever, is we need to be using meetings to get work done. If they're not
Mhm.
serving that purpose, often we see meetings are very much theatrical in terms of their performances. They connote the appearance of productivity, but not actually moving the work forward. And that's a key sign your meeting doesn't deserve to be on the calendar or hasn't intentionally been designed if it's purely theatrical as opposed to moving work forward.
Mhm. Is there maybe a misunderstanding that leaders have? I think just about any leader would probably say they need to fix meetings, right? But is there maybe a misunderstanding of what fixing meetings really means?
Yes, and at the core of it is the recognition that to fix our meetings, it takes a holistic approach, right? It's not as easy as slapping an agenda item or an agenda on a meeting. It requires often rebuilding from scratch. And so when I work with organizations, often the first step is to do a complete calendar reset. I call them meeting doomsdays, where you're removing recurring meetings off the calendar for a short period of time and then intentionally adding them back. Often it takes that reset to not only clear the meeting debt, but also clear some of our assumptions about what actually deserves to be a meeting.
Mhm. So you actually talk about treating meetings more like products. Can you maybe elaborate on that a little bit? What do you mean by treating them like products?
So when we think about meetings, meetings are the most expensive product in our entire organization. They're where decisions get made, priorities get set, culture gets built or broken, and yet they're the least optimized, as we've spoken about. Often we're using them as knee jerk reactions, often we're using them for everything rather than strategically. And so the premise of Your Best Meeting Ever is if we are to treat meetings like the strategic product they should be, well, we should be applying the same product design principles that we know make great products great. And so each of the 7 chapters of the book walks through a specific product design principle applied to meetings. So we talked about meeting debt as one of those principles, clearing your meeting debt just as you would product debt, where you accumulate shortcuts and patches and half hearted fixes over time, legacy code. We accumulate legacy meeting debt in a way that
Mm.
often this complete reset helps you to refactor the code and set the slate clean.
What a great insight. Speaking as someone who's got some product background, a tech career, you definitely know when a product is not being maintained or strategically moved along, right?
Mhm. Yes, and we can think about aspects like metrics as well. The one of the chapters in the book is on metrics. Just as we would A/B test a product, we need to or measure the return on investment of a product. We need to be applying that same discipline to measuring our meetings, and all of the other principles very much are taking what we know about great product development and applying it to meetings in a way that I think, especially for the tech companies, but broadly as well, helps people grok what's involved in this type of transformation around meeting culture.
You talk about 7 product design principles. Can you kind of walk us through those principles and maybe one that would be a good place to start?
Sure. So we've talked about the first one around meeting debt. Similar to product debt, we have this meeting debt where often a complete calendar sweep is required to reset your assumptions and your culture around meetings. The second is around metrics. So thinking about how are we measuring our meeting effectiveness, and the book walks through several strategies, both in terms of asking employees, but also increasingly in terms of using analytics and AI to distill what's actually happening in the meeting and whether that has been effective given the goals and the purpose of the meeting. The third one is around minimalism. So this again, when we think about great products, we know they're minimalist. Google homepage is the classic example. There's no clutter, there's no fluff. And so similarly, the more we can minimalize our meetings, the more effective and efficient they're going to be. And so I walk through 4 dimensions of meetings: the length, the attendees, the agenda items, and the frequency. And for each of those dimensions, unpack some strategies in terms of how do you think more minimalistic about meetings? How do you cut a 30-minute meeting to a 15-minute meeting? What are other strategies we can use to become a meeting minimalist? The fourth one is around systems thinking. So we can think about, I like to think about the metaphor of Apple products, right? Your iPhone isn't designed in isolation. It's been designed to connect to your Mac, to connect to your AirPods, and similarly, we need to think about meetings with a systems thinking lens. We know that often meetings we think are the problem, usually they're a symptom of a bigger problem, and that is a broken communication system. And in particular, when employees don't have clarity in terms of when do I use email versus when do I use Slack versus when do I use a meeting, they end up defaulting to the meeting because of this visibility bias and all sorts of social biases as well. And then the fifth one is around user centric design. So, just as we design our products with a user first mindset, at least great products, we need to be designing our meetings with a user centric approach. And so that means designing for the attendees, not designing for yourself as the organizer, and thinking carefully about how are you designing the meeting in a way that is going to be the best investment for the people in the room.
Mhm.
6 is around rhythm. So just as great products entice us with different rhythms, I often think about the Fitbit where it's nudging us to take a certain action at just the right time. We need to be thinking about the cadence and the rhythm of our meetings to align with, the fiscal calendar, our strategic goals, even thinking about pauses through the day and week. The rhythm of meetings matters. It's not about scheduling meetings wherever they fit on your calendar. We need to be considering the rhythm as well. And then the final principle is around technology. So innovating and iterating with technology just as we would great products. And right now, AI is most exciting and also most dangerous way to innovate with technology. And so I walk through how should you be thinking about bringing AI into your meetings and what are the specific roles that AI should or shouldn't play.
One of the things that we talk about in product development is the concept of iterations. What might the iterations look like from a meeting perspective?
It's such a healthy exercise to ask your team or do it yourself to continually propose different ways to innovate your meetings. And so I've done it with teams where every quarter, every month, in some cases, folks are submitting different ideas to iterate meetings, improve meetings, innovate meetings. And I think that constant sort of challenging of the status quo is what is often required to jolt us and keep us out of this inertia where we go through the motions with meetings, we reuse agendas week after week, we deploy the same weekly meeting, and we're not consciously, intentionally thinking about how do we design this meeting to meet the current moment and the needs of our team right now.
Mhm. So we're taking it a little bit at a time and we're continuing evaluating the success of the approach and then moving on and expanding as the data is kind of showing us.
Exactly, and when we think about that metrics principle, I recommend a simple metric called return on time investment. So just as we measure ROI of products, measuring return on time investment. And there are lots of reasons why this tends to be more effective than just asking people how effective the meeting was, because that tends to trigger this natural knee jerk negativity bias. Whereas if
Mhm.
you ask people to rate my meeting, the meeting I've led on a scale of 0 to 5 based on was this worth the time you invested? That helps to level set in terms of everyone has some intuitive sense of how well their time was spent, how well it was invested. And you start to get more feedback in terms of as you're doing this iteration, is it actually working? And is it working in the eyes of the people who you should be designing the meeting for rather than yourself as the organizer?
Mhm. Can you talk about the concept of meeting doomsday or the calendar cleanse?
Yes. So this is my favorite strategy, and I continue to see that it works wonders, especially when we think about that first dimension around meeting debt, clearing your calendar. So a meeting doomsday is a 48-hour calendar cleanse. Ideally, it's done at the organizational level, but I've done it with small teams of 9 employees. Employees are asked to delete recurring meetings for a period of 48 hours. After those 48 hours, they rebuild their calendars from scratch. So any meetings that they think are still valuable, they add them back to their calendar. But as they do so, they redesign them according to what they think is going to be most effective right now. And so I have various strategies for helping employees, make those determinations, think about the redesign. But what's fascinating is we see that most of the time savings, and the time savings tend to be significant, anywhere from, 5 hours per person per month to 11 hours per person per month. We find that most of the time savings actually comes from that redesign process. So, for sure, we see a lot of time savings come from deleting meetings permanently, never adding them back on the calendar, recognizing that they're legacy meetings and don't deserve to be added back. But most time savings actually come from this redesign. So, turning that 30-minute meeting into the 25-minute meeting, turning that 8-person meeting into the 4-person meeting, all of those
Mhm.
small changes add up in a way that is meaningful for the employee.
Mhm. A couple of thoughts. First is I've worked in organizations that have tried the concept of no meeting Fridays,
Mhm.
which is great in theory, but then that usually meant that the meetings that would normally be on Friday get added to the other days, which is a big one. And then now I work for an organization that has a concept of huddles. So instead of a meeting, it might be a huddle that's like a 15-minute huddle with the idea of making it more productive with fewer people. Could you maybe speak to those 2 examples, and are there pros and cons of them?
It's a great question, and there's lots to unpack for both types of meetings. When we take or meeting, initiatives, when we look at no meeting days, it's very important if you're going to implement no meeting days, make sure that it makes sense for your organization. And meaning, if you have an organization or a team within the organization where there are a lot of external meetings, most of the work involves, external collaboration, that's an example where no meeting days probably aren't going to work for your specific organization. Also distributed organizations, right? I've worked with organizations that try to deploy the no meeting Friday, but then, is it Friday for the US team? Is it Friday for the Japan team? All of these coordination hurdles need to be worked out. And most importantly, as you mentioned, what we often see is unless it's very intentional, those Friday meetings that are removed tend to be cluttered on the other days. And so, having something like a meeting budget can work here where you have a set number of meetings that you're allowed to have in a given week and using that as a gauge to understand, okay, I'm using this meeting no meeting day very intentionally. I'm not packing all my meetings on the Thursday or Monday such that you're eliminating the benefit of the no meeting day. That said, overwhelmingly, there's evidence in the value of no meeting days. And what's fascinating is not just in terms of productivity gains and time gains for focus time, but also in terms of outcomes like cooperation. What we see is when workers implement no meeting days, they need to become much more strategic if it's done right, if you're not cramming the meetings on the other days they become more cooperative because they need to be more intentional about finding those other ways to communicate and not, again, using meetings as the default reaction. The other thing we see in the research is micromanagement drops in general because managers no longer are using meetings so heavily as a surveillance tool to monitor their teams, collect updates. They start to need to trust their teams more, and so we see micromanagement drop as well in a way that is very healthy. So, in general, I'm a proponent of no meeting days, but it needs to be strategic. The leaders in the organization need to buy into it, and there needs to be a commitment and intentionality behind it.
Mhm.
And then huddles are interesting. Again, the design matters a lot. And often I'll see organizations deploy the weekly huddle, sometimes the daily huddle, where it's primarily aimed at status updates. And
Mhm.
status updates do not belong in meetings. And in the book, I outline a rule that helps organizations determine whether a meeting actually needs to exist. And the
Mhm.
first part of that rule is a meeting should only exist if the purpose is to decide, discuss, debate, or develop yourself or your team, the 4D test. Status updates do not meet that test. And often I find huddles end up being status updates that don't need to exist on the calendar. In some cases, they're very valuable. We know that standing up huddles as well can be very valuable in terms of these short, punchy, concise meetings, but it needs to pass the 4D test in order to justify being on the calendar.
Where do you think most of the backlash comes from when it comes to trying to relieve ourselves of meetings? Does it come from the executives and the leaders? Does it come from the more rank and file? Or does it come from both?
It comes from everywhere. In particular, it often comes from new managers. We
Mm.
see disproportionately new managers schedule more meetings and tend to run quite ineffective meetings as well. And largely that is because They're new to the role. They're learning how to coordinate and collaborate with their team. There's a lot of uncertainty. And again, meetings feel like the most reliable way to get everyone's attention, move work forward, when really there are much more strategic ways. So often we do see from managers in particular, but especially from those new managers.
Which makes sense because maybe you're trying to build some rapport and, you're trying to get a feel for your team. But you talk about how really it's an opportunity to define what really is the right tool for the communication and the update that you want to provide. So, are there some deciding factors that would help you know when, say, an email or some type of async would be better than a meeting?
Mhm. And this is a key hallmark when we look at remote first organizations, they tend to do this really well versus primarily in person cultures tend to not do it at all in terms of delineating what is the purpose of each of these communication tools in our tech stack? And the key is to get the meeting piece right. Help people understand what actually deserves to be a meeting. And that's where the 4D, I call it the 4D CEO test comes in. So we talked about the first part of the test. A meeting should only exist if the purpose is to decide, debate, discuss, develop yourself or your team. Even if it passes through that first test, it needs to pass through the CEO test, which is the content needs to be complex. C, there needs to be enough ambiguity, unknown unknowns, where a meeting is the most efficient way to make sense of that ambiguity together. E, is it emotionally intense? So if you're managing emotions, needing to read emotions, delivering tough feedback, that's the E. The O comes from Amazon. So is it a one-way door decision? Meaning
Mm,
once you walk through the door, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to revert course and go back the other way. And in those
mhm,
cases, typically getting in the room for 30 minutes, 15 minutes makes sense. The cost of misalignment is too high not to do that. And so there are all of these other things that don't pass the 4D CEO test, status updates, boss briefings, even brainstorming doesn't pass that test. And then it's up to the organization to understand, okay, given all these other asynchronous tools, not only what is the purpose of them, where do we share status updates, where do we send announcements? It'll differ organization by organization, whether that's email, whether that's a shared Slack channel. And
mm,
beyond that, what are the norms around how we use these channels as well? So, when do we direct message someone in Slack? When do we use a shared channel? We know that organizations that tend to have more of a transparent written documentation culture tend to have fewer meetings because people can start to self serve information. And so, I've worked with many companies where there's an explicit norm around sharing in public channels because even if right now that information isn't relevant to everyone, later on people can then self serve the information. And so delineating that as part of your communication tech stack is important again in giving employees clarity as to what is the purpose of this tool versus this tool and meetings positioning them as this last resort that passes the 4D CEO test.
mhm. Have you found that there might be any concern? We've all run into issues where the written word can not always come across the way we mean it to,
Mm.
which could potentially make for, say, a meeting later on or a big blow up in a channel, right? Do you have any recommendations for those situations?
It's such a great point, Tracy. And this is, again, remote first companies tend to do this really well because they're relying so heavily on asynchronous communication. And so, what I see in those companies in particular is people are explicitly encouraged to use high context when writing and when communicating through virtual means. And so if you're using an emoji, for example, and it's ambiguous as to how that emoji could be interpreted, put in parenthesis, I mean this. Be
Mm,
explicit about how you're communicating. I worked with an organization that had an organizational norm around no lazy asks. And I love that framing, meaning if you're asking for something from someone, be explicit about what you need, when, why, how. If you're in a globally distributed organization, don't say something like, I need this tomorrow. Be specific in terms of the time zone. All of those pieces allow you to communicate asynchronously and spend less time in meetings. And then when you find there's enough complexity, so when it's passing that C in the CEO test, that's when you
Mhm.
know a meeting deserves to exist if there's so much ambiguity as a result of the communication that doesn't happen in the meeting.
Got it. Thank you. So we're to the point where we've got our communication schedule, we've got our type of update mechanism. Now we want to be able to measure it. And you talked briefly about that return on time invested. Are there other metrics that might help, define the meeting quality? And we also talked about surveying a little bit.
Mhm. So I recommend the ROTI initiative after about 10% of meetings that you run. So if you're the organizer after about 10% of your meetings, asking that question, was the meeting worth the time you invested? And then there's a follow-up question. And I learned this from one of my colleagues, Elise Keith, who first introduced me to this concept. Ask a follow-up question in terms of what can I do as the meeting organizer that would lead you to improve your rating by 1 point? So then you're also getting some actionable feedback alongside the rating. Beyond that, I don't recommend, unless you're doing a very specific intervention around, we talked about iteration. If you're, and I do a lot of these interventions around understanding, what we can do to help teams meet more effectively. But beyond that, I don't recommend a whole bunch of surveying around meetings. Employees are overwhelmed. They're survey fatigued right now. I think the roadie and tailoring it to specific meetings is often much more productive. And then
Mhm.
pairing that with analytics. So we live in a world where now every meeting platform has some sort of analytical capabilities, some significantly more than others. Measuring things like airtime matter a lot. We know that equal airtime in the meeting is one of the strongest predictors of team performance. Multitasking is another one I recommend. And again, none of this is to call out or police behavior or surveil. It's input. Ideally, it should be put in the hands of employees to be able to self diagnose their participation and their contributions in meetings. But they're all such useful data points when we think about just how much time we spend in meetings to understand, even charisma score. Now there are meeting tools that will give you a charisma score based on how you show up and participate in meetings. All of this feedback is essential to helping us understand how do we design and optimize our meetings and hopefully have that best meeting ever.
Mhm. So, what does it look like to maybe add delight to meetings? So, you've got your turn on time invested, you have ideas for how to make the meetings better. But what about that concept of I guess delight or fun or enthusiasm? What does that look like?
It's important, and this falls into the bucket of user-centric design, designing the meeting to cater to your attendees. And when we think about meetings, we want them to be human. They're so expensive, they're so important within our organization where there needs to be that human touch associated with them. And a lot of my research, a lot of the book focuses on how to make meetings more efficient. That's absolutely important, but I'll often say, and my colleague Bob Sutton will say, the purpose of making our meetings more efficient is to make time for the things in work and in life that shouldn't be efficient. And delight is one of those aspects where having a moment of delight, which is a very unique combination of joy and surprise. So it needs to be something that employees, attendees aren't necessarily expecting. It can be as simple as a shout out within the meeting, or you're bringing some baked good from home in a way that you can tell a personal story around. Those moments of delight, they inject joy within participants, they make the meeting memorable, and employees start to want to show up for meetings rather than dread them on their calendar. And so it's an inefficient practice, but one that can only sometimes only needs to take 30 seconds and makes the meeting much more human and memorable.
Mhm. One example that I use with one of my teams is every Friday they get a happy Fri-yay, and that seems to sort of brighten everybody up just a little bit on a Friday morning and, get them a little more enthused about the meeting.
I love that, and that's all it takes. It's not, it doesn't necessarily need to be a heavy lift at all, but that moment of delight is important.
So, how is the nature of collaboration changing, and what does that do to meetings going forward?
It's a big question, and we've seen fascinating shifts over really since the turn of the century in terms of the time we spend collaborating. And one of my collaborators, Rob Cross, has done fantastic research to show over the past 2 decades or so, the time we spend collaborating has increased 50%. So we're collaborating more than ever in our organizations. We know we have more meetings. Now, increasingly, we're seeing that collaboration happen cross functionally within our organizations, much more so than we've seen in the past. So, no longer as a marketer are you working exclusively with the marketing team. There's always been a dimension of cross functional collaboration, but we're seeing it on a new level right now, and part of that is because work is becoming more complex. And we know any mission critical complex work within an organization needs to bring together different functions and groups of people. And then now we're seeing this other dimension of collaborating with AI and collaborating with agents. And
Mhm,
this is the hardest problem organizations are facing. They've started to understand how to use AI to improve individual productivity and identifying individual use cases. How that happens at the team level is something every organization is struggling with. What is that
mhm,
division of labor between humans and AI? And how do you also get your employees into the right mental mindset to embrace collaborating with something that inherently feels threatening to them is a very hard challenge, but will certainly impact the future of collaboration and the future of meetings. Because, Tracy, I'm sure you've started to see these bots joining the meetings. You have
mhm,
multiple AI transcript bots, you have
mhm.
people sending their digital twins to meetings. Again, it goes back to this intentionality and designing just as we would the humans in the room, making sure every AI, every bot has a clearly defined role in the meeting and it's not creating more distraction, more overwhelm, more friction. It's actually additive to the meeting.
Goes back to that intentionality that you talked about earlier.
Yes.
So, as we get to wrapping up here, for anyone listening who might feel overwhelmed right now by meetings, maybe what's one small, achievable change they could make this week?
So I love the strategy that comes from my friends and colleagues, Laddie Klotz and Bob Sutton, and they call it the rule of halves. And this falls into the principle around meeting minimalism. So essentially, what Leidy's work has shown is as humans, we are naturally conditioned to solve problems through addition. So we add more people to our organizations, we add more money, we add more meetings, we add more people to the meetings. And so the rule of halves encourages a subtraction mindset. And Leidy's work has shown that if you prime people to subtract, it dislodges that bias toward addition and people adopt a subtraction mindset. And it's often not that we don't like subtraction, often it's because it doesn't even occur to us that we can and should be adopting this mindset. And so the rule of halves can be applied to any one of those dimensions of meeting minimalism that I spoke about. So the length, the attendees, the agenda items, or the frequency. And I recommend as a start, take one of those dimensions, pick a meeting that you know hasn't been optimized, hasn't been intentionally designed, you dread it on your calendar, and think about what is one dimension, whether that's a 30-minute meeting, cutting it in half to 15 minutes, whether it's an 8-person meeting that's too big and has a bunch of spectators, cutting it to 4 people, moving a weekly meeting to every other week, or a status update meeting that has 8 agenda items. Try to pick the top 4. That type of meeting minimalism mindset is something that everyone can do and is a pretty lightweight way to get into that important subtraction mindset.
Love it. Thank you. What do you hope readers and leaders and organizations take away from your book?
I hope it's first and foremost the mindset around meetings. These are strategic products within our organization. We know that they have immense importance within the organization, but we need to be intentional about how we design them. And the promise of the book is you'll have your best meeting ever. And so that's what I hope for every reader. They walk away from the book ready to have that best meeting ever.
Fantastic. So, where can listeners go to connect with you and get the book?
So the book is available on Amazon, Your Best Meeting Ever, as well as your favorite bookstores. My website is rebeccahinds.com, and I'm on LinkedIn as well.
Terrific. Thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Rebecca Hinds. This is such an important topic, especially as we get close to the new year and want to be planning with more intentionality. So, thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I've loved the conversation.
And for our listeners, if you have enjoyed the conversation today, we hope you'll take some time and leave us a review on Spotify or on Apple Podcast. Let us know if there's anything you like and if we can do anything better. Thank you so much.